Welcome back to The Deep Dive, your essential guide to cutting through the noise and genuinely understanding complex topics. Our mission, as always, is to take a stack of information, distill it down to its most important insights, and deliver those aha moments that make you feel truly well-informed, without all the heavy lifting.
And today we're diving into a question that sounds, well, deceptively simple, but it quickly unfolds into this sprawling universe of intricate thought. What is analytic philosophy?
Right.
It's a field many have heard of, maybe encountered, but pinning down its precise definition, that's quite another matter. So yeah, prepare for a deep exploration into one of the most influential and dynamic intellectual traditions of the last century.
Absolutely, because when you first ask what is analytic philosophy, you might hope for, a crisp, straightforward answer. But the challenge lies in the very nature of defining an intellectual tradition, especially one that has evolved so much over time. It's an elusive concept, even for philosophers themselves.
Yeah, that's true.
We're talking about a tradition that has seen its own core tenets debated, redefined, and sometimes even outright rejected from within its own ranks. It's quite something.
Indeed. And the reason this question matters so profoundly is that most professional philosophers hold very strong, often conflicting views on it. Many statements you might read on the topic, while, instructive, can also be, at times, incomplete or even, frankly, a bit misleading.
Okay.
So that necessitates a clear and careful examination. We need to distinguish between a nominal definition, which simply describes how a term is used linguistically, within a specific context, and a real definition, which aims to capture the inherent, unchanging essence of a thing.
Right, the core nature.
Exactly. And given its dynamic and evolving nature, analytic philosophy might not really lend itself to a single, static, real definition. It's probably more useful to think in terms of a nominal one that describes how the expression analytic philosophy functions within a specific historical and intellectual context.
That makes sense. Understanding that distinction seems crucial.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's key to our journey of grasping this fascinating field.
So how are we going to navigate this rich, sometimes contentious landscape? Our guiding principle for this deep dive is to focus squarely on the themes, the core ideas, and the philosophical thought that truly defines this tradition. We'll be sidestepping the dense biographical details or, endless publication lists to keep our focus clear. Our aim is clarity, reflection, and helping you grasp the fundamental philosophical concepts at play.
And to achieve that, we'll embark on a structured journey. We'll begin by tracing the historical trajectory of analytic philosophy, exploring its foundational moments and those early analytical moves.
Okay.
Then we'll dive into its core doctrines and methods, examining the major transformations it underwent. Finally, we'll consider the critiques it has faced and continues to grapple with.
And importantly,
throughout, we'll ensure we connect back to you, the listener, asking why this knowledge is relevant and what insights it offers for understanding contemporary thought and maybe even your own way of thinking.
Okay, so to really understand analytic philosophy, we need to kick things off by recognizing that the concept of analysis itself isn't some brand new invention of the 20th century.
Not at all.
It has a surprisingly long and rich philosophical prehistory, doesn't it? Stretching back centuries before the modern analytic movement really took shape.
That's a crucial starting point.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here is how these early thinkers, each in their own way, established this kind of deep-seated analytic instinct. The idea that true understanding comes from breaking complex ideas down to their simplest, most undeniable parts.
Finding the bedrock.
Exactly. This quest for foundational clarity became a hallmark of analytic philosophy, even centuries before the formal movement began. Take Descartes, for instance. He viewed synthesis primarily as a method of exposition or proof. But for him, the discovery of new insights was an analytic process.
Okay.
It involved identifying what he called simple natures and primary notions that constitute reality, and then clarifying the logical links between them. It was about finding the building blocks.
So the basic building blocks of thought and reality itself.
Precisely. And then Leibniz took this even further with a more, radical idea. He believed that in all true propositions, the predicate is actually contained within the concept of the subject.
Contained within? How does that work?
It meant theoretically that all truth could be proven just by analyzing the subject, reducing them down to what he called identical truths. Through definition, much like how, arithmetic equations can be broken down to fundamental identities like 2 plus 2 is 4. It was a vision of ultimate exhaustive analysis.
Wow, that's a powerful and incredibly ambitious vision for analysis. Then the British empiricists shifted the focus somewhat, didn't they? They looked inwards more.
They did, yeah. Thinkers like John Locke, he engaged in what we'd probably call psychological cum epistemological analysis. His project involved breaking down complex ideas into simple ones. The aim was to discover the mind's fundamental constituents, which he believed were ultimately furnished by sensory experience. They weren't necessarily seeking the constituents of reality in general, like Leibniz perhaps, but rather the building blocks of human understanding itself. Where does our knowledge come from?
Oh, that makes sense. It's a different kind of analysis looking inwards at the mind rather than just outwards at external truths or logical structures. But then Kant comes along and seems to just reorient everything. He changes the very purpose of philosophy, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely pivotal. Kant's contribution was huge. He redefined philosophy as a cognitive discipline that, while distinct from empirical sciences, still aspired to a priori knowledge independent of experience.
Independent of experience, right.
He rejected the traditional Platonist or Aristotelian metaphysics, which, saw philosophy's role as examining abstract entities or being qua being. Instead, Kant introduced transcendental metaphysics.
Transcendental metaphysics, what did that involve?
Well, for him, philosophy's task wasn't to discover new facts about the world, competing with science. Instead, it was to clarify the logical, the conceptual, the methodological preconditions necessary for us to have knowledge in the first place.
Ah, okay. So philosophy wasn't about finding new facts, but about understanding the very framework that makes finding facts possible, the rules of the game, so to speak.
Precisely. The conditions of possibility for knowledge itself.
Right.
And this reorientation was deeply influential. It led directly to neo-Kantianism, which really dominated German philosophy between, say, 1865 and World War I.
Right.
This movement sought to preserve philosophy's sui generis, or unique status, as a second-order discipline. Rather than trying to out-science science, neo-Kantians saw philosophy's role as clarifying the preconditions of knowledge, ensuring it remained a distinct and respected intellectual pursuit, truly one of a kind in its unique approach.
So while Kant was busy redefining philosophy's purpose, it sounds like another kind of quiet revolution was brewing, not just about what we analyze, but how, especially in the world of logic and mathematics. Was this the true genesis of analytic philosophy's really distinctive approach?
You've hit on the key moment, yes. And what a moment it was. This period truly was a watershed. While thinkers like George Boole had already begun to, mathematize syllogistic logic, turning it into a system of algebraic operations on sets.
Okay, algebra for logic.
Kind of, yeah. But the most crucial development came with Gottlob Frege and his groundbreaking Begriffsschrift, his concept script published in 1879. Frege's system was based on function theory, which was a radical departure.
Function theory, like in mathematics.
Exactly. While Boole sort of mathematized logic to see it as a branch of mathematics, Frege pioneered logicism. This was his ambitious project to provide mathematics with secure foundations by deriving it entirely from logic itself.
That's a huge undertaking to build all of mathematics purely from logical principles. It sounds almost impossible. But how did he manage to overcome the limitations of the older Aristotelian logic, which had been around for literally centuries?
Frege achieved this by radically rethinking the structure of propositions. Imagine traditional logic saying, the sky is blue, by pointing to sky as the subject and is blue as the predicate.
Yeah.
Simple enough.
Right.
Frege, though, looked at it more like a recipe or a function in math. He'd say, X is blue. X is a slot, a variable, and you can fill it with sky, ocean, or car. He broke propositions down into function and argument.
Okay, so his blue is the function and sky is the argument you put into it.
Precisely. The value of the function, whether the statement is true or false, changes depending on what you substitute for X. This seemingly small change was actually huge because it allowed logicians to precisely describe much more complicated relationships, especially when you have multiple moving parts in a sentence, multiple variables interacting.
That's a powerful way to express relationships, and I can see how that would unlock new possibilities. And it led to the famous quantifier variable notation, didn't it? That must have been a real game changer.
It absolutely was. This notation was groundbreaking. For example, take all electrons are negative. It isn't analyzed as all electrons being a subject and are negative a predicate. No. Instead, it becomes for all x, if x is an electron, then x is negative.
Ah, using variables and conditions.
Exactly. This formalization of propositions, especially those involving multiple generality, where you have phrases like every x and some y interacting, was absolutely essential for mathematics and allowed for unprecedented precision. It could clearly capture the difference between, say, a true proposition like, for every natural number there is a greater one, and a false one like, there's a natural number which is greater than all others.
Okay, I see the power there.
And crucially, this notation also revealed fundamental flaws in long-standing philosophical arguments, like the ontological argument for God's existence. By showing that existence isn't really a property of an object, like being blue or round. It's more like a property of a concept specifically, the property of having objects falling under it. Saying God exists isn't like saying God is good. It's saying the concept God has an instance. This allowed for a kind of logical scrutiny that simply wasn't possible before.
So it wasn't just about clearer logic for math, but about uncovering hidden logical structures that could even reveal errors in ancient philosophical arguments. That's a profound impact. Frege also introduced his famous distinction between sense and meaning, along with his three-world ontology, partly to combat psychologism, right? What exactly did that entail, and why was it so important to him?
Right. Frege was deeply concerned about grounding logic and mathematics in something stable and objective, separate from the fuzziness of human psychology, which he felt made truth subjective and changeable.
He wanted objective truth.
Exactly. So he distinguished between the meaning, Bedeutung, of a sign, which is its referent, the actual object it points to in the world, and its sense, Sinn, which is the mode of presentation of that referent, how it's given to us.
Can you give an example?
Sure. This is a classic example. The morning star and the evening star. Both phrases have the same meaning or referent the flare. They both point to the planet Venus, but they clearly have different senses, different ways of presenting Venus, based on observation at different times.
Ah, okay. Same object, different descriptions or ways of thinking about it.
Precisely. And Frege emphasized that sense is objective and independent of individual minds. It's something grasped by anyone who understands the sign. The sense of a whole sentence, he argued, is the objective thought it expresses, and its meaning is its truth value, whether it's true or false.
Okay. And the three worlds.
Right, the three-world ontology. This was his way to combat psychologism, the idea that logical and mathematical truths are just facts about how human minds happen to work. Frege absolutely rejected that, he proposed. World 1 is your private, subjective ideas inside your head. World 2 is the world of physical objects around us.
Okay, mind and matter.
But then, crucially, there's a third realm, a kind of shared objective space for things like mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4, the senses of words and sentences, objective concepts like redness. These aren't just in your head like an idea, and they're not physical objects like a chair. They just are timelessly true, existing independently of us.
Like Platonic forms, almost.
Sort of, yes.
Yeah.
It's a kind of Platonism about concepts and thoughts.
Yeah.
He believed this third realm was where logic and mathematics found their stable, mind-independent foundation. He wanted to ensure they weren't just products of human psychology, but something objective that we discover, not invent.
He really wanted to secure that objectivity. But his grand project of logicism, deriving all of math from logic, ultimately ran into a major snag, didn't it?
It did, tragically, despite its immense intellectual achievements. Frege brilliantly defined cardinal numbers using purely logical notions of sets or classes. His logicism culminated in his masterwork, the Grundgesetz der Arithmetik, Basic Laws of Arithmetic. However, his system made unrestricted use of sets, including the idea that sets could contain other sets as members. And this led directly to Russell's paradox.
Ah, the famous paradox.
The very same, discovered by Bertrand Russell. It involves the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. The question is this set a member of itself? If it is, it shouldn't be. If it isn't, it should be. It's a flat contradiction.
A real mind bender.
It completely undermined the logical system Frege had built. Russell communicated this paradox to Frege just as the second volume of the Grundgesetz was about to be published. It effectively derailed Frege's entire life's work at the final hurdle, a truly heartbreaking moment in intellectual history.
Devastating. And speaking of Russell, he, along with G.E. Moore, really marks the next major development we need to talk about, this revolt against idealism. What was the intellectual climate like in Britain at that time that they felt compelled to rebel so strongly?
Well, Britain at the turn of the 20th century was heavily under the sway of something called British idealism. This was a kind of delayed assimilation of German idealism, particularly Hegelian thought.
Okay, so thinkers like Hegel were influential.
Very. Idealists like F.H. Bradley argue that everyday objects, mind-independent individual things, actually led to contradictions if you thought about them carefully. They proposed that ultimate reality wasn't made of separate things, but was an indivisible whole, an absolute, common sense and science. Well, they were considered at best partially true, mere appearances of this deeper, unified reality.
So the chair I'm sitting on isn't really real in the ultimate sense.
According to someone like Bradley, not in the way you think, it's an appearance. Now, Moore and Russell, who were initially sympathetic to idealism, came to completely reject this. Russell famously described their rebellion as feeling a great liberation, as if I had escaped from a hothouse into a windswept headland. He said he rejoiced in the thought that grass really is green. It was a powerful, almost visceral rejection of what they saw as overly complex, counterintuitive, intellectual obfuscation.
I love that image, escaping the hothouse into the wind. So Moore advocated for common sense and painstaking conceptual analysis. What did that look like in practice for him?
Moore's approach was really about getting back to basics. He called for common sense beliefs, like, this is a hand, the earth existed before I was born, as starting points that were more certain than any complex philosophical theory denying them.
Yeah.
And he advocated for painstaking analysis over what he saw as the dazzling dialectics of the idealists.
Less flash, more substance.
Exactly. He believed a thing becomes intelligible first when it is analyzed into its constituent concepts. His view of analysis was primarily a decomposition of complex concepts, including the propositions we express, into their simpler constituent concepts, ideally via definition. He was really concerned with combating the idealist denial of mind-independent objects, insisting on the straightforward reality of everyday things like chairs and tables. He wasn't so much interested in constructing grand new theories, but in clarifying what we already know to be true through common sense.
Just making clear what we already grasp. And Russell's logical analysis was perhaps even more sweeping and ambitious than Moore's focus on concepts, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Russell was much more forceful. He emphatically declared, leaving absolutely no room for doubt, that all sound philosophy begins with logical analysis. He even compared the advance it represented to Galileo's revolution in physics.
High praise indeed.
He genuinely sought solutions to long-standing philosophical problems through this rigorous analysis and believed that only by analyzing could philosophy make real, demonstrable progress. Russell's main target was the monistic idealism of Bradley, the idea that reality is one indivisible whole. Russell contrasted his own view, a bucket-of-shot view of reality, made up of discrete individual entities, with Bradley's bowl of jelly, where everything merges together.
Bucket of shot versus bowl of jelly. Nice visual.
And his conception of analysis, heavily influenced by Frege, was fundamentally logical rather than just conceptual like Moore's. It was inspired by the way mathematical definitions could resolve contradictions and paradoxes. The new logic allowed him to take philosophically puzzling propositions and paraphrase them into formal language, thereby avoiding commitment to dubious or non-existent entities.
And that's where his famous theory of descriptions comes in, isn't it? To deal with tricky sentences like, the present king of France is bald, a sentence that seems to refer to something that doesn't actually exist.
Precisely. For Frege, such a sentence would lack a truth value, because there's no king of France for it to refer to. Russell, however, rejected Frege's sense-meaning distinction, finding it overly complicated. Instead, he analyzed the present king of France is bald into a more complex logical structure, essentially, a quantified conjunction.
Okay, break that.
It boils down to saying there is one and only one thing which is a present king of France, and everything which is a present king of France is bald. Now, because the first part of that conjunction, there is one and only one king of France, is false, the whole sentence comes out false, not meaningless.
Ah, so it handles the non-existence problem cleanly.
Exactly. It showed the definite descriptions like the present king of France are incomplete symbols. They don't actually name anything on their own, but get their meaning from the way they function within the larger sentence structure. This theory was hailed, quite rightly, as a paradigm of philosophy. It offered a powerful method for resolving age-old puzzles about existence and identity without having to posit shadowy, non-existent entities. It was a real intellectual triumph of analytical rigor.
It certainly sounds like it. So we've seen this incredible initial phase, this intense emphasis on logical and conceptual analysis, really rooted in these breakthroughs in mathematics and logic, and driven by a direct, forceful rejection of grand, overarching idealism. Here's something to think about for you listening. How did this early, very distinctive tone, this focus on precision, on breaking things down, on formal structures, on discrete entities, set the stage for everything that followed? How did it define what would become analytic philosophy, making it feel like such a deliberate break from other ways of doing philosophy?
It really feels different, doesn't it? Okay, so that initial emphasis on logic, clarity, and analysis led us pretty directly into what's often called the linguistic turn. This is a really pivotal phase where language itself became absolutely central, not just for expressing philosophical problems, but for actually resolving them.
Precisely. And a key, often quite enigmatic figure in this turn was Ludwig Wittgenstein, especially in his early work, the famous Tractatus Logico-Philosophica.
Tractatus, right. Very influential, very dense. Extremely. On it, Wittgenstein argued that the core function of language is to depict possible states of affairs, to picture the world, essentially. He drew a very sharp distinction between propositions that are empirically meaningful. They describe facts about the world and can be checked, or logically meaningful things like tautologies, it is raining or it is not raining, or contradictions, like in mathematics.
Okay, so facts and logic.
Right. And then there was everything else, which he essentially classified as nonsensical metaphysical pronouncements, things that try to say something about the limits of the world or values or the nature of language itself from the outside. His famous example, the class of lions is not a lion, tries to say something about the logical type of a class. But according to the Tractatus, that kind of statement falls outside the bounds of meaningful depictive language.
So he's drawing very strict limits on what can be meaningfully said?
Extremely strict. And he radically concluded from this that philosophy is not a doctrine that discovers new truths or facts. Instead, it's an activity. Its job is the critique of language, clarifying scientific propositions, and crucially, revealing metaphysics as basically nonsense.
Wow.
Famously, he concluded the Tractatus by saying that one must understand its propositions and then recognize them as nonsensical. You must, as he put it, throw away the ladder after you have climbed up it. The book itself was meant to show the limits of language, not to state profound metaphysical truths.
That's a pretty radical stance, saying that much of traditional philosophy, especially metaphysics, isn't just wrong, it's literally meaningless. It's almost like they were trying to, I don't know, logically legislate metaphysics out of existence. And this idea really resonated with the Vienna Circle and logical positivism, didn't it? They picked up this thread and ran with it.
Oh, absolutely. The logical positivists, based mainly in Vienna in the 1920s and 30s, aimed to develop a thoroughly consistent empiricism using the tools of modern logic. They enthusiastically adopted many ideas from Wittgenstein's Tractatus, emphasizing their famous verificationist criterion of meaningfulness.
The verification principle, that's key, isn't it?
Absolutely central. The idea, simply put, is that a proposition is factually meaningful only if it can, at least in principle, be empirically verified, checked against experience. If you can't say how you would check if it's true or false, it's not really saying anything factual about the world.
So statements about God or absolute morality or the meaning of life?
According to the strict verificationists, those would likely fall outside the bounds of meaningful discourse. They might express emotions or attitudes, but not facts. This criterion fueled their fervent crusade against metaphysics, which they saw largely as theology in disguise or just meaningless wordplay.
Theology in disguise, harsh.
Think of Rudolf Carnap's famous critique of Martin Heidegger's lecture, What is Metaphysics? Particularly the phrase, Das Nichts nichtet, the nothing noths. Carnap argued such statements violated logical syntax by treating a quantifier, nothing, as if it were the name of some mysterious entity that does things, rendering the whole statement grammatically confused and therefore meaningless.
So a failure of logic, not just a philosophical disagreement.
Exactly. Though it's worth noting, Wittgenstein himself apparently had mixed feelings about this aggressive war being waged in his name. He didn't necessarily advocate for such polemics. His aims were perhaps more therapeutic, dissolving confusion rather than attacking opponents.
Interesting distinction. So their core critique of metaphysics wasn't just that it was mistaken, but that it was fundamentally flawed at a deeper level. It was linguistically meaningless, nonsensical.
Yes, precisely. They argued that metaphysics suffered from a more basic defect than simply being false. It was nonsensical. It addressed pseudo-questions that couldn't actually be answered because they weren't genuinely meaningful questions to begin with. You could trace this idea back, perhaps, to Moore's insistence on questioning the question, making sure you understand what's being asked before trying to answer it, and also to Russell's theory of types, which was designed specifically to rule out paradoxical or meaningless combinations of concepts. It was a powerful attempt to establish clear boundaries for what could even be thought or said meaningfully in philosophy.
But the linguistic turn didn't stay stuck in this very rigid formal logic and empirical verification phase, did it? It seems like it evolved, especially with the work of the later Wittgenstein and the rise of Oxford philosophy, moving from that strict logical construction towards a more nuanced form of conceptual analysis.
That's a crucial and really transformative shift in this story. The later Wittgenstein, after returning to philosophy following a break after the Tractatus, fundamentally rejected many of his earlier ideas about logical analysis and construction. He moved decisively away from the notion that language has a hidden, underlying logical form that philosophy needs to uncover.
So what was his new picture?
He now saw language not as a kind of abstract mirror reflecting logical structure, but as a deeply human practice, a tool embedded in a social form of life. Language is something we do. He introduced the incredibly influential concept of family resemblances.
Family resemblances, right, for concepts like game.
Exactly. He argued that many ordinary concepts, like game, aren't united by a single sharp definition with necessary and sufficient conditions that all games must meet. Instead, they're united by a network of overlapping similarities, like different members of a family sharing some features, but no single feature being common to absolutely all of them.
Like a web of connections rather than a strict box.
Precisely. And for him, the rules of language cannot be hidden. Competent speakers already know how to use words. They must be able to recognize the rules in their everyday use. So, philosophy, in this later phase, becomes primarily a description of our public linguistic practices and the various language games we play with words. Its aim is therapeutic, to resolve philosophical problems that arise from linguistic confusion, from taking words out of their normal context rather than building grand theories. Philosophy leaves everything as it is, he famously said.
So less about constructing ideal languages and much more about carefully observing how we actually use language in everyday life, in context. And this influenced a whole generation of philosophers, particularly at Oxford like Gilbert Ryle, who wanted to map the logical geography of concepts.
Yes, Ryle's work, especially his book, The Concept of Mind, was a prime example of this Oxford ordinary language philosophy. He argued that many classic philosophical problems like Cartesian dualism, the idea of a non-physical mind or ghost somehow operating a physical body machine, arise from fundamental category mistakes.
Category mistakes.
It's like confusing things that belong to different logical types. For example, treating mental concepts like intelligence or belief as if they referred to hidden, ethereal processes happening inside us, parallel to physical processes. Ryle argued these concepts actually signify complex behavioral dispositions or capacities, how someone is likely to act or perform in certain situations. He saw philosophy as a meta-discipline that talks sense about concepts, rather than talking with them to discover new facts about the world. Its job is to clarify our conceptual tools, revealing how category mistakes lead us astray.
So untangling conceptual knots caused by misusing language.
Exactly. He believed analysis was far from trivial, precisely because explaining these philosophically interesting concepts is so complex and rich, especially when you look carefully at how they are used in everyday or scientific language.
And J.L. Austin, another key Oxford figure, further developed this focus on language use with his speech act theory, insisting that language does much more than just describe facts.
Austin brought a really systematic, almost scientific approach to studying ordinary language. He famously rejected what he called the descriptive fallacy, the dogma, inherited perhaps from the Tractatus and the logical positivism that language's primary or sole function is to state facts or describe reality.
What else does it do?
Well, we use language to make promises, issue commands, ask questions, express feelings, perform ceremonies. I now pronounce you. These are speech acts, things we do with words. Austin meticulously cataloged these different uses, and he famously insisted that ordinary language is not the last word. It is the first word, meaning that while ordinary language might sometimes be vague or misleading, and we might need to refine it for scientific or philosophical purposes, any new technical term or scientific neologism ultimately has to be explained and understood in terms of the ordinary language we already grasp. So paying incredibly close attention to how central concepts are actually employed in their normal surroundings, whether everyday or specialized, is an essential precondition for doing sound philosophy. It was a profound shift towards understanding language as a versatile toolkit for doing all sorts of things in the world, not just passively describing it.
It really does sound like a profound transformation, moving from seeing language as this rigid logical structure mirroring reality to observing its incredibly fluid, diverse social functions. For you listening, how did this shift from analyzing language for underlying logical forms to understanding its ordinary use and social function, how do you think that changed the very nature of philosophical inquiry? It seems to make philosophy feel closer, perhaps, to disciplines like anthropology or sociology, doesn't it? Less purely abstract.
It's an excellent point, and it raises fascinating questions about philosophy's relationship with other fields. This shift indeed broadened philosophy's scope, making it less about purely formal systems and perhaps more engaged with lived experience and actual conceptual practice. However, this expansive phase, this focus on ordinary language, soon faced its own set of powerful challenges, leading, perhaps surprisingly, to what we might call the collapse of logical positivism and the unexpected return of metaphysics.
So, what happened? How did a movement like logical positivism, which seemed so dominant, especially with its verificationist criterion, start to unravel?
Well, it wasn't just one thing. Internal critiques played a significant role, definitely. But also external political events were huge. The rise of Nazism in Austria and Germany, for example, forced many of the leading logical positivists who were often Jewish, left-wing, or both to emigrate, mostly to the UK and especially the USA. This diaspora fundamentally reshaped the movement and shifted its centers of influence across the Atlantic.
Okay, so the political context was crucial. What about the internal critiques? Who were the key figures challenging positivism from within the broader analytic tradition?
The main protagonist here, without a doubt, was the Harvard logician and philosopher W.V. Quine. Now, Quine was deeply indebted to the positivists, especially Carnap. He shared their admiration for logic, their empiricist leanings, their preference for clear, often artificial languages, but he aimed to improve on them, pushing their empiricism towards a more holistic, pragmatist variety. And he launched a devastating challenge to two core tenets of positivism.
Which were?
First, the very idea of a sharp analytic synthetic distinction. This is the distinction between truths that are true purely by virtue of meaning, analytic like all bachelors are unmarried, and truths that are true based on facts about the world, synthetic like the cat is on the mat. Quine argued in his famous paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, that this distinction couldn't be clearly drawn. He claimed that our beliefs form an interconnected web where logic, math, and empirical claims are all ultimately answerable to experience as a whole, just some are more central and resistant to revision than others.
That's huge. If you can't clearly separate truths of language from truths of fact, it seems to undermine a lot of the positivist project, which relied heavily on that distinction.
Immensely so. It was like pulling the rug out from under much of analytic philosophy's earlier assumptions, including the idea that philosophy could deal purely with analytic truths, leaving synthetic truths to science. Quine's critique, combined with his rejection of the second dogma, reductionism, the idea that every meaningful statement can be translated into statements about immediate experience, led him to a thoroughgoing naturalism.
Naturalism, meaning philosophy should be more like science.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
For Quine, philosophy is continuous with natural science, perhaps even just a particularly abstract branch of it. He rejected any notion of first philosophy in some a priori standpoint outside of science from which you could judge science. This required a new approach to knowledge itself, naturalized epistemology. Instead of trying to provide a priori justifications for knowledge, Quine argued epistemology should simply become a chapter of psychology or cognitive science, scientifically investigating how humans actually form beliefs based on sensory input.
So studying belief formation scientifically, not trying to justify it from an armchair.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
In Quine's wake, this naturalistic conception became incredibly influential, achieving near orthodoxy, especially in the USA. He essentially said, let's stop pretending philosophy is fundamentally different from science and just treat it as part of the same overall empirical enterprise.
And around the same sort of time, another major figure, Karl Popper, was also challenging logical positivism, though from a different angle, focusing on its verificationist criterion for meaningfulness.
Yes, that's right. Popper, though sometimes associated with the Vienna Circle, was always a critic. He fundamentally rejected verificationism as the criterion for separating science from non-science, or metaphysics. His main argument was that universal scientific laws, all swans are white, can never be conclusively verified. You can't check every swan, but they can be conclusively falsified. Finding one black swan does the trick.
So falsifiability, not verifiability, is the key for science.
That was Popper's demarcation criterion. A theory is scientific if it makes predictions that could, in principle, be proven wrong by empirical observation. Crucially, this meant that metaphysics, while not scientific, because often unfalsifiable, wasn't necessarily meaningless either, as the positivists claimed. In fact, Popper argued that metaphysical speculation provides an invaluable stimulus to scientific research, often suggesting bold new ideas that could later be developed into testable scientific theories. He saw metaphysics not as nonsense, but as a potentially fertile, speculative ground for scientific progress, directly opposing the positivist crusade against it.
Okay, so between Quine blurring the lines between philosophy and science and Popper defending metaphysics as potentially valuable, we're seeing the door being firmly reopened to metaphysics, which the positivists had tried so hard to slam shut and lock. How did this actually lead to the rehabilitation of metaphysics within mainstream analytic philosophy? It seems like quite a turnaround.
It really was. The post-Quinian era saw a significant blurring of the boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural science, as one commentator put it. Several factors contributed. One was the flourishing of modal logic, the logic of necessity and possibility, often analyzed using the concept of possible worlds. This provided new, rigorous tools for exploring metaphysical questions about what must be true or what could be true.
Tools for thinking about necessity.
Exactly. Another major development was the rise of direct reference theories of meaning, spearheaded by figures like Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam in the 1970s. They argued, contrary to Frege and Russell, that certain kinds of terms like proper names, Aristotle, and natural kind terms, water, gold, refer directly to their objects or kinds without needing a Fregean sense or a Russellian description to mediate the reference.
How did that lead back to metaphysics?
Well, it led to a surprising revival of essentialism. Kripke argued, for example, that if water refers directly to the substance H arrow, then it's a necessary truth that water is H arrow. It couldn't have turned out to be something else, even though we had to discover its chemical composition empirically, a posteriori. This broke the traditional Humean and Kantian links that tied necessity firmly to the a priori and analyticity.
So necessary truths discovered through experience.
Exactly. It forced a reevaluation of categories that the positivists had often conflated. A priori, an epistemological category, how we know it; necessary, a metaphysical category, how things must be; and analytic, a logical semantic category, true by meaning. Kripke and Putnam argued compellingly that these were distinct categories. There could be truths that were necessary but a posteriori, like water is HO, and truths that were contingent but a priori, like Kripke's example involving the standard meter bar in Paris. This blew the old framework apart and made serious, systematic metaphysics respectable again within analytic philosophy.
It really does sound like quite a dramatic reversal, from wanting to eradicate metaphysics as meaningless nonsense to bringing it back into the fold with sophisticated new logical and semantic tools. So here's a reflective question for you, the listener. With this resurgence of metaphysics and the rise of Quinian naturalism, how much of the original linguistic turn, or that strong anti-metaphysical stance of the positivists, actually remains influential in contemporary analytic philosophy? Has the pendulum swung back completely, or has something fundamental about the way philosophy is done changed forever because of that period? We've traced the historical evolution, the twists and turns from logicism to language games to the return of metaphysics, but now let's tackle a common misconception head-on. Many people tend to think of analytic philosophy as a purely Anglophone phenomenon, something exclusively British or American. But that image simply isn't the whole story, is it? It's more complex than that.
Not at all. The Anglo-centric model is a significant oversimplification, often quite misleading. If you look at the roots, the revolution in rigor that really initiated analytic philosophy involved key figures who weren't British or American at all. Think of the American logician C.S. Peirce, or the Italian mathematician Giuseppe Peano, whose logical notation Russell adopted.
Right, it was international from the start.
Absolutely. And Bertrand Russell himself, often seen as a cornerstone of British analytic philosophy, owed an immense intellectual debt to Continental influences, most importantly the German philosopher and logician Gottlob Frege. Frege's logical notation and his analytic methods were absolutely foundational to Russell's own work, something Russell explicitly acknowledged in the preface to Principia Mathematica.
So a German was key to Russell's project.
Undeniably. And even more critically, the early philosophical work of the Austrian Ludwig Wittgenstein had a profound, almost transformative impact on the predominantly German-speaking logical positivists of the Vienna Circle. They spent hours reading the Tractatus line by line, seeing it as a decisive turning point precisely because it seemed to offer a logical method to finally end sterile metaphysical debates.
So the Vienna Circle, a key analytic group, was mainly German-speaking and heavily influenced by an Austrian, definitely not just Anglophone. And there's this idea sometimes mentioned of an Anglo-Austrian axis existing in opposition to German idealism. What was that all about? Is there any truth to it?
Yeah, this thesis was advanced by figures associated with the Vienna Circle, like Otto Neurath, and later by the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Haller. They suggested this historical narrative of an Anglo-Austrian analytic axis, basically, British empiricism and common sense philosophy, finding common cause with certain strands of Austrian thought, like Brentano's or Mach's empirical realism, and opposing the perceived excesses of German idealism, especially Hegelianism.
Okay, a united front against Hegel, maybe?
Kind of. And there were certainly kernels of truth in it. You can find shared tendencies like a rejection of grand speculative idealism, a respect for empirical science, a focus on clarity in some Austrian thought that resonates with British empiricism. However, it significantly oversimplified things. It tended to gloss over Kant's enduring influence even within these supposedly anti-idealist circles, and it ignored the considerable diversity within Austrian philosophy itself. It wasn't all proto-analytic by any means. So it was perhaps a useful narrative for them at the time, forging alliances, but it doesn't capture the full historical complexity.
It sounds like these neat geographical classifications, Anglophone, Continental, Austrian, often struggle to capture the messy reality of intellectual influence. And then, as you mentioned earlier, there were significant political catalysts, particularly the rise of Nazism, that further diversified and spread analytic philosophy, weren't there?
Indeed, profoundly so. The political upheavals in Central Europe in the 1930s forced a mass exodus of brilliant thinkers, many of whom were central figures in analytic philosophy and logical positivism, people like Carnap, Hegel, Hempel, Tarski, Neurath himself. They emigrated mostly to the USA, but also to the UK and elsewhere.
So a brain drain from Europe fueled analytic philosophy in America.
Absolutely. This significantly shaped the subsequent development and dominance of analytic philosophy in American universities in the post-war era. Today, analytic philosophy truly flourishes globally. You find analytic philosophers working in departments all over the world, writing in various languages. It's neither purely geographical nor purely linguistic anymore. The whole analytic continental divide, while still sometimes used as a shorthand, is increasingly seen as a problematic cross-classification. It lumps together very different thinkers on both sides and overlooks other major movements, like American pragmatism, Dewey, James, Peirce, which doesn't fit neatly into either category. The real philosophical disagreements, it turns out, about realism, naturalism, the role of language, cut across all these geographical and linguistic boundaries rather than neatly following national borders.
Okay, that thoroughly debunks the purely geographical myth. Now let's pivot to another common criticism we sometimes hear, that analytic philosophy is somehow ahistorical or even actively historiophobic. Is it true that analytic philosophers just tend to ignore the history of their own discipline or philosophy in general?
Well, this criticism isn't pulled out of thin air. It often stems from analytic philosophers themselves, sometimes expressing a certain, pride in their enterprise's supposedly ahistorical nature, especially in the early to mid-20th century.
Why would they be proud of ignoring history?
For the early logical positivists, and maybe the early Wittgenstein, the history of philosophy often appeared as largely a history of nonsense, conceptual confusion, or fundamental errors, especially the post-Kantian German idealist tradition they were reacting against. They believed that philosophical problems weren't really meant to be solved in the way historical problems are, but rather dissolved through logical clarification. The idea was that once you had the right logical tools, the old problems would just disappear, revealed as pseudo-problems arising from linguistic misuse.
Like a mathematician doesn't really need to study the history of arithmetic mistakes to do good math today.
Exactly that kind of analogy was often implicitly or explicitly invoked. And Quine, much later, famously quipped that there are two kinds of people interested in philosophy, those interested in philosophy and those interested in the history of philosophy, suggesting a clear disciplinary separation, much like the one between practicing natural science and studying the history of science.
Okay, so if philosophy is aiming to be like science, maybe it feels it doesn't need to dwell on its founders or past mistakes in the same way. But you're suggesting this isn't entirely accurate, that many analytic philosophers do actually engage seriously with the history of philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. The general charge of historiophobia, especially today, is largely overblown. While some might fit the stereotype, many analytic philosophers adopt what's sometimes called weak historicism. This means they fully acknowledge the importance of understanding the historical and intellectual context in which philosophical ideas and arguments were originally developed.
So context matters.
Context matters, definitely. And they often favor what are sometimes called problematic histories. That is, histories focused on tracing the evolution of specific philosophical problems, like the problem of universals, or skepticism, or mind-body interaction, and the various solutions or approaches proposed over time, rather than just giving a purely chronological recounting of who said what when. G.E. Moore, for example, really emphasized the importance of clarifying the question being asked, which often involved looking critically at how those questions were framed and understood by past philosophers. Progress, in this view, doesn't always mean finding definitive final solutions, but achieving a better, clearer understanding of the problems themselves and the range of conceptual options for dealing with them, often deeply informed by studying historical attempts.
That's a subtle but really important distinction. Not just history for history's sake, but history as a way to understand the problems we still grapple with. But what about the challenge of incommensurability? This is the idea, often raised by more radical historicists, that different philosophical perspectives or conceptual schemes from different eras might be so fundamentally distinct that they can't be objectively compared or even properly understood from our current standpoint. How do analytic historians deal with that?
That's a core challenge from historicism, definitely. There are generally two main types discussed. First, semantic incommensurability. The idea that different theories or paradigms might use key vocabularies that are so distinct in meaning that they can't be accurately translated or compared point for point. Second, epistemic incommensurability. The idea that different theories might even operate with different fundamental standards for what counts as good evidence, valid reasoning, or even knowledge itself.
That sounds like it could make historical comparison impossible.
It could seem that way. However, many analytic philosophers argue against the strongest versions of these claims. For semantic incommensurability, they might point out that even if direct translation is difficult, mere meaning variance doesn't necessarily entail complete translation failure or incomprehensibility. You can often use more complex compound translations or learn the conceptual apparatus of the other theory well enough to understand it from the inside without necessarily endorsing it.
Okay, you can learn the language, so to speak.
Right. And regarding epistemic incommensurability, the argument often involves the principle of charity in interpretation, famously discussed by Donald Davidson. While Davidson's strong version, assuming maximal agreement, might be too strong, a weaker, more plausible version suggests we should interpret past thinkers in a way that makes them appear as rational and their beliefs as coherent as possible, given their context. The flat Earth example is often used here. Someone in the past believing the Earth is flat is still talking about our Earth, the same object, even if their beliefs about it are incorrect. You don't have to be right about X to be successfully referring to and speaking about X.
So disagreement doesn't automatically mean we're talking past each other about completely different things.
Exactly. This more robust approach allows analytic historians to feel justified in assessing past theories, not just for historical interest, but also for their truth and cogency by contemporary lights, rather than being forced into a purely descriptive relativism where comparison is impossible. They can still ask, was Aristotle right about this?
That's a powerful argument for maintaining continuity and the ability to genuinely learn from and critically engage with the history of thought. So here's another reflective question for our listeners. How does our understanding of a philosophical concept, or maybe even a scientific one like atom or gene, change when we consider its historical evolution? When we look at the original context and the specific problems it was initially introduced to solve, rather than just focusing on its current definition or use, does understanding that journey enhance our grasp of the destination, or does it simply complicate things unnecessarily?
That's an excellent question. Really gets to the heart of why studying history matters. And this leads us nicely to another common way people try to define or categorize analytic philosophy, by looking for a shared set of core doctrines or specific topics. Is there a common creed, a set of beliefs, or a distinctive range of subjects that truly defines what it means to be an analytic philosopher?
That seems like it should be the most straightforward way to define any school of thought, right? Just look at what they believe in and what sorts of things they typically talk about. Easy.
You'd think so, but perhaps unsurprisingly by now, it turns out to be a really difficult, maybe even impossible path for pinning down analytic philosophy. Let's take some candidates. Consider the rejection of metaphysics, which we discussed earlier in the context of logical positivism.
Right. The positivists' crusade against metaphysics.
Exactly. They saw metaphysics as largely meaningless, theology in disguise. But was this stance universal among all analytic philosophers? Even then, not at all. Frege, arguably one of the founders, was deeply committed to the existence of abstract objects like numbers and senses in his third realm. That's a clear, robust metaphysical claim. Russell and Moore in their early realist phase were arguing for the existence of mind-independent physical objects and even abstract universals. And as we've already seen, metaphysics made a major comeback in later analytic thought with Kripke, Lewis, and others. So anti-metaphysics certainly cannot be a defining doctrine of the entire tradition. Wittgenstein even used the metaphor of philosophical theories often being like houses of cards that needed careful dismantling. But he wasn't necessarily against all forms of metaphysical thinking, just certain kinds of confusion.
Okay, so anti-metaphysics is out as a universal definer. What about the linguistic turn itself? Surely that's a defining feature. The idea, maybe, that philosophy of language is the foundational philosophical discipline.
Well, the linguistic turn was undoubtedly incredibly influential, shaping decades of work. And prominent figures like Michael Dummett explicitly argued that what distinguishes analytic philosophy is precisely this post-Fregean conviction that the philosophy of language holds the key, that analyzing thought requires analyzing language first.
That sounds plausible.
It does, but again, there are significant counterexamples and nuances. Think about the early analytic figures like Moore and Russell during their logical atomism phase. They were arguably more interested in discovering the ultimate constituents of reality, the logical atoms and facts, rather than primarily focusing on language analysis per se. Language was a tool, perhaps, but metaphysics and epistemology seemed primary.
Okay, so not even universally true at the beginning.
Right. Furthermore, later major figures like Quine and Davidson,
Right.
while deeply concerned with language, emphasized the study of natural languages and their connection to broader patterns of human behavior and interaction with the world, moving away from the idea of a purely formal foundational philosophy of language, providing all the answers. And Wittgenstein himself, especially in his later work, saw philosophy's main task as solving or dissolving specific philosophical problems that arise from linguistic confusion, not necessarily building a general theory of language or meaning as the foundation for everything else. However,
Yes.
it's undeniable that in practice, a very close, often unstated link between analyzing concepts and propositions and analyzing the meaning of the words and sentences used to express them remains absolutely central to the methodology of much analytic philosophy. It's often the default way of approaching problems, even if it's not explicitly held as the foundational doctrine. So it's a pervasive methodological orientation, maybe, rather than a strict defining subject matter.
A characteristic approach rather than a core belief. Okay. What about its relationship with science? Does analytic philosophy see itself as fundamentally distinct from science or as continuous with it? Is there a common stance there?
Here again, you find a fascinating spectrum of views, not a single unifying doctrine. On one side, you have figures like the early Wittgenstein in the Tractatus and the logical positivists who generally viewed philosophy as a second-order discipline. Its role was distinct from science. Philosophy clarifies the logical structure of scientific language and concepts, or analyzes the conditions for meaningfulness, but it doesn't compete with science in discovering empirical facts about the world. It reflects on science. It doesn't do science.
Okay, philosophy as the underlaborer or clarifier for science.
Sort of, yes. But on the other side, you have thinkers like Russell, who sometimes saw philosophy as a kind of proto-science, tackling fundamental questions that were not yet amenable to empirical methods, but aspiring to emulate scientific methods wherever possible, aiming for piecemeal yet steady progress. And then, of course, you have Quine's naturalism, which went much further, essentially blurring the boundaries altogether and seeing philosophy as continuous with natural science, perhaps just the most abstract or general part of our total scientific inquiry.
So complete continuity for Quine.
Right. And today, this debate continues. You have various forms of naturalism, metaphilosophical, about philosophy's method, epistemological, about knowledge, ontological, about what exists, which are very influential, especially in the U.S., but you also have prominent, powerful anti-naturalist figures within analytic philosophy thinkers like Peter Strawson, Saul Kripke, John McDowell, Michael Dummett, even the later Hilary Putnam, who argue forcefully for philosophy's autonomy and distinctness from the natural sciences. So again, no unified front here at all.
No consensus there either. It's starting to feel like defining this tradition by doctrine is like nailing jelly to a wall. What about topical interests then? Does analytic philosophy at least stick to a fairly narrow, identifiable set of subjects? logic, language, epistemology, mind. Are there topics that just generally won't touch?
Well, if you looked maybe in the 1950s or 60s, you might have gotten that impression of strong focus on those core areas. But if you look at analytic philosophy today, the answer is emphatically no. Quite the opposite, in fact. While its origins were closely tied to discussions in mathematics, logic, and the philosophy of natural science, analytic philosophy has shown a truly remarkable, almost relentless broadening of its topical interests over the last few decades.
Really? Like what?
Oh, it has expanded to include and often make major contributions to virtually any significant area of human thought, as one observer put it. We now see thriving subfields in analytic philosophy of the body, philosophy of sexuality, serious analytic engagement with environmental ethics, eco-philosophy, feminist epistemology and metaphysics, philosophy of race, philosophy of computing and artificial intelligence, analytic approaches to psychoanalysis, philosophy of law, political philosophy. The list goes on and on.
So it's not confined to specific topics at all?
Not anymore, if it ever truly was.
Mm-hmm.
It seems analytic philosophy is less defined by what topics it addresses and more by how it addresses them, applying its characteristic methods of careful argumentation, conceptual clarification, and logical rigor to an incredibly diverse and constantly expanding range of subjects. It often spearheads philosophical inquiry into new areas, bringing a level of precision and clarity to them that might have been lacking before.
Okay, so if analytic philosophy isn't really defined by a single shared doctrine, or even by a narrow, fixed set of topics, what on earth holds this incredibly diverse, historically evolving, internally contested movement together? What is its unifying thread, if one even exists? Is it just the method, then? We've explored the history, we've busted some myths about geography and doctrine. Now, let's circle back and dig much deeper into what many people believe does define analytic philosophy. Its distinctive method. We keep using the word analysis, if analysis is really at its core, but as we've hinted, it's not just one single monolithic thing. What are its different faces? How has analysis itself evolved within the traditions?
This is absolutely where we need to look, because analysis has indeed taken on quite different forms, evolving significantly over the centuries, and even within the analytic movement itself. We can trace a rough evolution. Historically, going way back with figures like Descartes and then the British empiricists like Locke and Hume, analysis was largely understood as decompositional.
Breaking things down.
Exactly. Breaking complex ideas or concepts down into their supposed simple natures, for Descartes, or simple ideas, derived from experience, for the empiricists, to find their basic, fundamental constituents. The goal was to reach the bedrock of thought or experience.
Okay, finding the simple building blocks.
Right. Then a major shift occurs with Leibniz, and especially later with Frege, Russell, and the early Wittgenstein. Here, analysis becomes primarily logical analysis. This wasn't just about finding simpler concepts, but about revealing the underlying logical structure of propositions, often using the tools of modern formal logic.
Like Russell's theory of descriptions we talked about.
Precisely. That's a paradigm case. It sought to paraphrase philosophically puzzling propositions, like those involving definite descriptions or existence claims, into a more perspicuous formal language, like predicate calculus, to reveal their true logical form and, crucially, to avoid misleading ontological commitments to dubious entities like a non-existing king of France. Definite descriptions, for Russell, were shown to be incomplete symbols that have no meaning in isolation but contribute to the meaning of the whole sentence in a complex way. The goal was logical clarification and dissolving philosophical puzzles by exposing their logical structure.
So, taking a complex or misleading sentence and translating it into a more precise, canonical logical form to see what it really implies or presupposes. But this focus on uncovering a hidden logical form evolved again, didn't it? Particularly with the later Wittgenstein, who seemed to move away from that picture.
Yes, that's another crucial pivot point. The later Wittgenstein and the ordinary language philosophers he influenced, like Ryle and Austin, shifted away quite dramatically from this kind of reductive logical analysis or construction. They largely rejected the Tractatus idea that ordinary language has a hidden, perfect logical form that analysis needs to excavate.
So what did analysis mean for them?
For him, conceptual analysis became less about decomposition or logical translation and more about carefully describing the rule-guided use of philosophically contested expressions in their actual contexts. Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances was key here. Understanding a concept often involves mapping its various overlapping uses and connections, rather than searching for a single sharp defining essence or logical form. Analysis became more about elucidation, or what Peter Strawson later called connective analysis, explaining a concept by mapping its implications. its presuppositions, its contrasts and connections were other related concepts within our conceptual scheme. Ryle, for instance, talked about charting the logical geography of concepts, showing how they relate to one another and how category mistakes arise when we misplace a concept on that map.
So analysis transformed from decomposing things to logically formalizing them to then meticulously describing how we actually use conceptual tools in our language games, understanding their social role and interconnections. And there was also logical constructionism or explication, right, associated with Carnap and Quine. That sounds a bit different again.
Exactly. With figures like Carnap, especially in his later work, and Quine, we see analysis taking the form of logical explication or rational reconstruction. Here, the aim of analysis isn't necessarily just about uncovering some pre-existing hidden logical form, nor is it simply about defining synonyms or describing ordinary use. It's often an act of deliberate construction or replacement.
Construction. How so?
The idea is to devise alternative, more precise, or scientifically more fruitful expressions or conceptual frameworks that can serve our cognitive purposes equally well or better than the original, often vague or problematic concepts, while avoiding their philosophical or scientific drawbacks. Carnap, for instance, sought to replace vague talk with more precise logical constructions. Quine looked for ways to paraphrase away ontological commitments he found dubious. It's about engineering better conceptual tools for specific cognitive tasks, rather than just analyzing the ones we happen to have.
Refining or replacing concepts for clarity or scientific utility.
Precisely. And this connects to the widespread use of puzzle cases and thought experiments in much analytic philosophy today. Think about intricate scenarios cooked up to test intuitions about personal identity, teletransporters, brain swaps, or Kripke's and Putnam's ingenious examples involving twin Earths or mistaken identities to probe our understanding of natural kind terms and reference. These are used to explore the boundaries, the implications, and sometimes the inadequacies of our existing concepts, often pushing towards refinement or revision. This really fits with Russell's early vision of philosophy as being piecemeal and tentative, pursuing a divide-and-conquer strategy on complex problems, much like other sciences trying to build understanding incrementally.
That's a really helpful overview of the diverse toolkit that falls under the umbrella of analysis. It's clearly not just one thing. But beyond these specific methods, what about the overall style? Analytic philosophy is very often associated, almost stereotypically, with a particular kind of writing and thinking prioritizing clarity. Is that its defining stylistic feature, often explicitly contrasted with the perceived obscurity of some continental philosophy?
The aspiration for clarity is certainly a deeply ingrained hallmark, almost a defining virtue within the tradition. You see it stressed again and again. G.E. Moore famously aimed to distinguish clearly questions that previous philosophers had muddled together. Wittgenstein and the Tractatus declared that the purpose of philosophy is the logical clarification of thoughts, seeing philosophy not as doctrine, but as an activity resulting in elucidations.
Making things clear.
Right. And the logical positivists, viewing themselves as heirs of the Enlightenment project, explicitly strived for neatness and clarity in thought and expression. They actively rejected what they saw as the dark distances and unfathomable depths favored by some other philosophical traditions, particularly German idealism and existentialism. Carnap, for instance, even spoke of the emotional needs fulfilled by clarity, precision, and formulating responsible, testable theses, seeing it as part of a broader scientific, rational, and even progressive cultural orientation.
So, an explicit, almost ethical commitment to intellectual transparency. It sounds like they're very proud of this clarity, seeing it as a mark of intellectual honesty. But is that clarity always achieved in practice? And is it really unique to analytic philosophy?
Well, that's where it gets tricky. It's not always achieved, not by a long shot. There's a striking irony, for instance, that Wittgenstein's own Tractatus, despite its stated aim of ultimate clarity, was famously referred to by Frank Ramsey as consisting of syncopated pipings, implying it was pretty obscure. Even his later philosophical investigations, while containing passages of remarkable lucidity, is overall a notoriously difficult book to interpret due to its aphoristic, nonlinear structure. And Russell's early work on logic is incredibly dense and technical.
So even the giants weren't always crystal clear.
Not always. And conversely, it's simply not true that all so-called continental philosophers are obscure. Some write with admirable clarity. So clarity isn't an exclusive possession. Perhaps the real scandal, as one commentator pointed out, is that analytic philosophy itself, despite championing clarity so fiercely, has actually rarely devoted much rigorous philosophical discussion to analyzing the nature of clarity itself. What exactly does it mean for a piece of philosophy to be clear? Is it simplicity, lack of ambiguity, formalizability, testability. It's often treated as an obvious, intuitive virtue rather than something that needs its own philosophical analysis, which is a bit of an oversight for a tradition that prides itself on exactly that kind of analysis.
That's a fascinating and quite pointed observation. Okay, let's move from style back to substance, but maybe substance of a different kind. The relationship between analytic philosophy and ethics and politics. We touched on this briefly, but there's a common charge often leveled against it that it's inherently apolitical, maybe even conservative by default, because it focuses on abstract, logical, or linguistic puzzles instead of engaging with real-world social and political problems. Is this a fair criticism?
This accusation has a long history, often voiced particularly by critical theorists like Herbert Marcuse back in the 60s. He saw analytic philosophy, especially the ordinary language variety dominant then, as essentially trivial, dealing with pseudo-problems and promoting conformity by focusing on existing language use. He felt it was disconnected from the profound problems of human life and perhaps prone to what was later called instrumental reason, being very good at figuring out how to achieve pre-given goals, technically efficient, but without critically examining the values or goals themselves.
So fiddling while Rome burns, essentially.
That was the gist of the critique, yes. And it's true that some leading analytic philosophers, particularly in the mid-20th century heyday of logical positivism and its immediate aftermath, did tend to shy away from normative ethics and political philosophy. They often favored logic, epistemology, or philosophy of language, perhaps seeing these areas as more amenable to precise, objective, rigorous analysis, whereas values seemed subjective and messy. Bertrand Russell himself is an interesting case. He was famously a hugely committed political activist and writer on social issues.
Right, very outspoken.
But he often explicitly regarded his ethical and political pronouncements as stemming from his passions and commitments as a human being, rather than directly from his scientific philosophical work. He tended towards non-cognitivism in ethics, believing that fundamental ethical notions were ultimately subjective expressions of emotion or desire, and thus, strictly speaking, outside the purview of objective, factual, scientific philosophy.
But wait, didn't we say earlier that the logical positivists themselves, especially the Vienna Circle's left wing, had a strong, explicit political dimension? They seemed to directly connect their philosophical outlook to advocating for social change.
They absolutely did. That's a crucial counterpoint. Figures like Otto Neurath and Rudolf Carnap were explicitly socialist and saw their scientific worldview as intrinsically linked to moral and social progress, rational planning, and emancipation from superstition and traditional power structures. Carnap bluntly stated that the struggle against metaphysics was part of a much broader historical struggle against superstition, theology, traditional morality, and the capitalist exploitation of the worker. Their 1929 Vienna Circle Manifesto even celebrated the scientific worldview's potential to penetrate and reform all forms of personal and public life, including education and economic organization, according to rational principles.
So the idea that analytic philosophy is inherently ethically neutral or necessarily apolitical just doesn't hold up historically. It clearly had an explicit political engagement in its early formative days, even if some of its later practitioners, like maybe Russell in his philosophical capacity, preferred to keep their philosophical work separate from their value commitments.
Exactly. The picture is much more mixed. And the critique that it's existentially insignificant or fundamentally disconnected from profound problems of human life certainly doesn't hold true for all analytic philosophers, especially today. Many contemporary analytic philosophers actively engage directly in normative ethics, applied ethics, and political theory. They explicitly question the old positivist fact-value distinction that tried to banish values from rational discourse.
So they are tackling moral issues head-on.
Absolutely. They don't typically claim some kind of special, privileged, intuitive grasp of moral facts, but they do argue for their particular ethical or political views with the characteristic analytic tools of clarity, logical consistency, and cogent argumentation. The intense debates surrounding the work of Peter Singer, for instance, particularly his challenging utilitarian views on issues like animal rights and euthanasia, are a very prominent, if often highly controversial, example of analytic philosophy engaging directly with deeply sensitive moral and social issues.
Right. The Singer affair caused huge uproar in Germany, didn't it?
It did, partly because of the methods used, often employing quite abstract or far-fetched puzzle cases to test the logical consequences of ethical principles, but also because of the extreme political sensitivity surrounding topics like euthanasia in Germany, given the horrific legacy of the Nazi era. This demonstrates engagement, definitely, but also highlights how philosophical argument, even when aiming for pure rationality, can intersect in complex and sometimes explosive ways with deeply held societal values and historical traumas.
This leads us to another potential way of characterizing the tradition. Maybe analytic philosophy is best defined not by its content, but by its commitment to a certain process, the rationalist ideal. Is it fundamentally defined by its unwavering commitment to argument, evidence, and justification, a kind of dialogue of reason?
This is certainly an appealing idea, and it has been proposed by philosophers like Jonathan Cohen and the influential Norwegian philosopher Dagfinn Follestad. They suggest that what really characterizes analytic philosophy is that it's very strongly concerned with argument and justification. This rationalist ideal emphasizes tackling philosophical problems in an explicitly rational way, demanding clear reasons for accepting or rejecting any position. It values precision, logical coherence, clarity about assumptions, and responsiveness to counter-arguments and evidence.
That sounds like a pretty good description of the aspiration of analytic philosophy. But if that's the definition, isn't that just defining all good philosophy, stretching all the way back to Socrates in the marketplace? I mean, isn't the commitment to reasoned argument the very essence of the entire philosophical enterprise, distinguishing it from myth or dogma?
Exactly. That's the main problem with this definition. It seems either far too broad, making virtually all philosophy since the ancient Greeks analytic in spirit, or, if interpreted too narrowly, perhaps requiring adherence to specific logical forms or standards of evidence, it risks excluding figures who are undoubtedly part of the analytic tradition, but might question the universal scope of reason or formal argument, like perhaps the later Wittgenstein or certain Humean skeptics within the tradition.
So it doesn't quite work as a unique identifier.
It seems not. The attempt to tackle fundamental questions through reasoned argument, critical reflection, and justification, rather than relying solely on tradition, authority, or revelation, has arguably been a distinguishing feature of philosophy as such in most of its guises, since its origins. So while a strong commitment to reasoned argument is undoubtedly a central virtue that analytic philosophers champion and strive for, perhaps more self-consciously than some other traditions, it probably cannot uniquely demarcate analytic philosophy as a specific historical movement or school of thought. It might function more as an honorific title for doing philosophy well, rather than a useful tool for clear taxonomy.
Okay, so even the commitment to reason isn't a unique enough marker. This really leaves us to the contemporary state of affairs, looking at what we might call the analytic industry and its discontents. On the one hand, you hear optimistic views, people suggesting philosophy is finally nearing maturity, achieving scientific-like rigor. But on the other hand, you also hear significant internal critiques and even outright pessimism about its current direction. What's going on there?
It's a fascinating tension, absolutely. You have optimists like Timothy Williamson at Oxford, or previously Michael Dummett, who have expressed a belief that philosophy, armed with the sophisticated logical and conceptual tools developed over the last century, is finally in a position to make real, cumulative progress, perhaps even establishing certain metaphysical truths with a kind of rigor approaching that of science. This echoes that long-standing hope, going back to Russell or even Leibniz, of transforming philosophy into a systematic, collaborative, progressive discipline.
Philosophy finally growing up, maybe?
That's the optimistic view. However, you also hear a much more somber assessment, as one writer put it, coming from an equally impressive lineup of figures from within the analytic tradition itself. Peter Hacker, a prominent Wittgenstein scholar, sees much of contemporary analytic philosophy, especially metaphysics and philosophy of mind, as suffering a kind of decline, lapsing back into precisely the kinds of scientific overreach and confused metaphysical speculation that Wittgenstein warned against. Hilary Putnam, towards the end of his career, criticized what he saw as an exclusionary tone and a tendency towards scholastic dogmatism in certain areas, noting how current orthodoxies often simply ignore important historical alternatives or dissenting voices.
And Bernard Williams, too.
Yes. Bernard Williams, in some influential late essays, acknowledged analytic philosophy's undoubted virtues, things like clarity, patience, argumentative rigor. But he also lamented what he saw as its increasing scientistic tendencies. trying too hard to mimic the sciences. Its neglect of history, its often narrow professionalism, and its disengagement from broader humanistic concerns and from other disciplines in the humanities. So it really does seem like a field experiencing both undeniable technical triumphs and a real palpable sense of internal unease or even crisis about its direction and purpose.
So a mix of triumph and crisis. What are some of the specific common grievances or critiques that are voiced, often quite sharply, from within the tradition itself about its current state?
Several recurring criticisms frequently pop up in these internal debates. First, there's the charge of scholasticism. This refers to a perceived hyperspecialization, a focus on an increasingly very narrow range of issues, leading to endless, minute refinements of arguments, what critics sometimes call epicycles on epicycles, without making much substantive progress on the big questions. It involves technicality often seeming like an end in itself, sometimes leading to what one critic memorably called narcoleptic pedantry. You hear jokes about spoof paper titles like Black on White on Brown on Grue, mocking the endless commentary on commentary.
Right, philosophy disappearing into tiny rabbit holes.
That's the worry. Second, there's the charge of disengagement. A perceived detachment not only from other disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, but perhaps more importantly, from the wider educated public and pressing societal concerns. Philosophy talking only to itself. Third, linked to this is factionalism and exclusion. Accusations sometimes surface of cronyism and inbreeding within certain dominant subfields or methodological camps, and an exclusionary tone, sometimes bordering on arrogance towards non-Anglophone philosophy or even just towards different approaches within the analytic tradition itself. You sometimes hear arguments for intellectual hygiene being used to justify not reading certain challenging Continental thinkers like Derrida, for example.
Using rigor as a gatekeeping mechanism, perhaps.
That's the concern, yes. And fourth, there's the critique Bernard Williams labeled stylistic scientism. This isn't just about philosophy borrowing methods from science, but about adopting a certain style that pretends to scientific objectivity or certainty. Williams criticized, for example, the pretense in some philosophy of mind that it's practically doing neurophysiology, or the kind of writing style he called mind control, which tries obsessively to anticipate and preempt every conceivable objection, no matter how remote or implausible, resulting in incredibly dense, defensive, and often unreadable prose that stifles genuine dialogue.
Those are some pretty pointed internal critiques. And this climate of debate also connects, doesn't it, to the broader academic conflict, sometimes called the science wars. These were intense arguments, especially in the 90s, about the nature and authority of science itself. How does analytic philosophy fit into that larger picture? Was it all on one side?
That's a good connection to make. The science wars broadly concerned the status of scientific theories. Does Western science provide a uniquely objective account of reality? Or is it, to some extent, a social construct influenced by culture, power, and perspective, like other human endeavors? Now, it's crucial here to distinguish between, on the one hand, outright abuse of scientific concepts or rhetoric, as seen in some postmodernist texts that seem to deliberately misuse or misunderstand science, famously exposed in the Sokol hoax, where a physicist got a nonsensical parody paper published in a leading postmodern cultural studies journal.
Right, the Sokol hoax. That was big news.
And, on the other hand, legitimate philosophical debates about scientific realism versus anti-realism, relativism, and social constructivism regarding scientific knowledge. While combating the first kind, clear intellectual malpractice or abuse of science is something most analytic philosophers would strongly support, the second category involves complex philosophical issues where analytic voices can be found on both sides of the debate. There are respected analytic philosophers who defend forms of anti-realism, instrumentalism, or even conceptual relativism about science. So the science wars weren't simply a case of analytic philosophy defending science against continental postmodernism attacking science. The fault lines were and are much more complex, running through analytic philosophy itself. The ongoing aim from an analytic perspective is always to try and differentiate clearly between genuine, rigorous intellectual inquiry into the nature of science, however radical or controversial its conclusions might be, and what might be seen as outright intellectual imposture or obscurantism.
That's a really crucial distinction to maintain.
Yeah.
I'd say, given absolutely everything we've discussed, its complex origins, its shifts through logicism and linguistic turns, its surprising rehabilitation of metaphysics, its diverse and evolving methods, its internal debates and critiques, its global spread, if analytic philosophy as a concept is maybe best understood not by necessary and sufficient conditions, but more like Wittgenstein's idea of a family resemblance concept, where different phases and figures share overlapping similarities rather than one single defining essence. And if we also see it as primarily a historical sequence of individuals, schools, and influential relationships. What does this complex picture tell us about the likely future direction of philosophical inquiry? Does it suggest a continued fragmentation into ever more specialized subfields? Or perhaps might we see a return to broader, more unifying themes or questions? Where does it go from here? Outro. And that, I think, brings us towards the end of our really deep dive today into this fascinating and clearly quite slippery question. What is analytic philosophy?
We've journeyed through its incredibly complex history, haven't we? From those early roots in the logical rigor of Frege and Russell, through the various linguistic turns led by Wittgenstein and the Oxford philosophers, right up to its internal debates, the critiques it faces, and the surprising rehabilitation of metaphysics in recent decades.
We certainly have. It's become abundantly clear, I think, that this is a dynamic, living tradition. It's constantly evolving, constantly debating its own identity and methods, and it really does seem to defy any single, simple, static definition.
Indeed. We've seen how analytic philosophy is perhaps less like, say, a precisely defined chemical element with a fixed atomic structure, and much more like that Wittgensteinian family resemblance concept we just mentioned. It seems to be held together not by some single, unchanging essence, but by a complex network of overlapping similarities in methods, in preoccupations, in argumentative style, and by direct relations of influence connecting figures and schools across its turbulent historical sequence.
A family with all its shared traits and internal squabbles.
Exactly. And this understanding that such a powerful and influential intellectual tradition can be so diverse, so internally contentious, yet somehow remain identifiable and cohesive in its own way, perhaps prompts a final provocative thought for you to take away and reflect on. You see, the ongoing debate over what is analytic philosophy often seems to reflect deeper, perhaps more fundamental, questions of the very purpose and nature of philosophy itself in the modern world. Is philosophy's primary goal to solve definitive problems, perhaps in a way analogous to science? Is it mainly to clarify language and dissolve conceptual confusion? Is it to dissect and map our concepts? Is it to critically engage with society's values and political structures? Or is it perhaps something else entirely and quietly? Maybe simply to keep the practice of rigorous, open-ended rational inquiry alive in a complex world. As we've seen today, analytic philosophy in its various phases and guises has arguably tried to be all of these things at different times and often simultaneously. Considering its ongoing, undeniable triumph in terms of global influence and technical sophistication, alongside its persistent internal crisis regarding its direction and relevance. Perhaps the most profound question it continues to pose for us is not simply what analytic philosophy is, but rather what philosophy itself, in its best, most rigorous, and most valuable form, should be and can be in our increasingly complex, demanding, and often confusing world. What do you think philosophy's role should be today?